Hey there, John Morris here, johnmorrisonline.com. This lesson, this is kind of a simple form tutorial. Now, there's still a little bit that goes on here, but what I want to show you here is the base connection from your HTML form to your PHP processing script and ultimately into your MySQL database, how those three things all connect up. So that's what we're going to be going through here. Real quick before we get into that, I just want to get a couple things kind of out of the way so that we don't get bogged down with those. So over here, first off, our structure, I have three files. I have config.php, which we'll get to in a minute. I have simple.php, which is the one you're looking at now, has most of the code, the form, and the processing script and all that. And then I have this style.css. So the style.css is pretty just basic CSS. I'm not going to go through all of this because I want to really focus on the PHP parts of this. But it's what kind of gives this the little bit of the look here. So I didn't want it to be just a completely kind of plain form, but it's just some very, very basic styling here. All right, and so like I said, I'm gonna pretty much not cover that anymore after this point. All right, so the first thing that I really want to go through here is I want to cover the form real quick, and then I want to hop into the database and show you how to create the database that we're going to submit this into. And then that'll give us kind of where we're starting with the form, where we're ending with the database, and then we can talk mainly about the code between the two. Okay, so if we come down to the form, just ignore this all up here for a second. Starting here with this doc type declaration, I have a standard kind of HTML page that you would have here with an HTML tag, a head tag, body tag. I'm setting the character set. This is for mobile responsiveness here. I'm linking in my style sheet right here. I have my title tag here. So this head area, nothing really special about this. This is all pretty much standard HTML stuff. You see I have this kind of PHP block here. We'll get to that in a second. I don't want to go into that yet because it doesn't really make sense until we get into the code part of this. So the big thing that I want to focus on right now is this form part. So this is the actual form that we see over here on the right. So when we write our form tag, there's a couple things that we need to specify at a minimum. So we need to specify the action, and the action is essentially where we want to send the data that's going to be submitted by the form. So in this case, we've left it blank, and what that means is that this form data that gets submitted is actually going to be submitted right back to this same page. So this is what would be called a self-submitting form, and that's why our PHP code that processes it is right here on this same page. Now, if you wanted, you could put something like, say, process.php here, and then you could come over here and you could create a new file called process.php, and you could take all of this code and put it over there if you wanted. One, I wanted to keep all of the code kind of in one place so we weren't bouncing around between a ton of files. B, a lot of times a self-submitting form like this is perfectly fine for what you need. So I just decided to do it like this. There's not any necessarily, there's not necessarily a right way to do it, but that's just what I've decided to do here. Next is the method, and it's set to post. Now, the two main options that you can put here are either post or get. And you may or may not be familiar with those. Essentially, the difference is if you submit data via get, so if we were to change this to get like this, what that would do is when this form is submitted, all of that data would be appended to the URL as query parameters, and that's where you would actually pull the data from. So and most of the time, the only time you really do that with kind of standard forms is with a search form. And the reason you do that with a search form is because if you want to link to certain searches, then all you need to do is have the query. You can run the search, grab the query parameter, you can actually link directly to that search without having to submit the form to do the search. When we have a form like this where we're entering, a name and email, it's kind of sensitive data, generally we don't want to put that in the URL. So most of the forms that you're going to have are going to use this post method. I would say default to using post unless you know for sure or have some compelling reason why you need that data in the URL up here. After that, I've got kind of some standard HTML here. So I'm wrapping each one of these fields in a div with a class of form field. That's just to kind of help style a little bit. You certainly don't even have to do that if you want. It's not necessarily super important here. You can see each one of the inputs and then the button are all inside one of these form field divs. The main thing here is these input types. So we're doing an input tag. We're setting the first one to a type of text because that's our name, and so we just want text, string text there. We're setting the class to text, so we could target it with our CSS. Then the big thing here is we're setting the name of this input to name. Okay, so you could, if that were too confusing, you could do full name, you could do first name, whatever you want the name of this to be. When you're going to process it in code, that's what you would set here. The placeholder here, that's what puts this enter your name thing in here. So that's what the placeholder does. That's kind of a new sort of HTML5 type thing. And then we have this tag here called required, which means HTML will see, the browser will see this field as required. And so if we actually try to submit this form without any data, it'll say please fill out this field. So that's an easy way to have some really basic input validation there. But again, the big thing for our code purposes is the name of this is set to name. And we have another input field. The type is set to email. So by setting the type to email, what this is going to do is it's actually going to provide us a little bit of validation. So if we try to do JJJ and we don't have any @ here, right, and we try to submit this form, it's going to say please include an @ in the email address. And so it's going to, again, do some basic email validation. Now, it's not foolproof. For example, you could do jjj@bbb, and it would let me submit this form. Okay, so again, it's just real basic, but we kind of use everything that's available to us. Again, here we kind of have this set to class of text again. We have the placeholder here, but the name of this one is now email. Okay, so, and then we have our button down here. I've set a button with a class type of button, so we could target in CSS. Pretty straightforward. All right, so that's the form. The main things, again, like I said, are this name, are the name elements here. These are what are going to show up in our code, and I'll show you where here in just a second. Okay, so actually, let me just go ahead and do that here. So I'm going to do print r, and I want to show you how this data is submitted. Print r and post, and then we're going to exit right after that. So we're just going to print what's in this post block, and then we're going to kill the script so that we can see what's in there. So I'm going to type in my name and just an email address here. I'm going to hit submit. Oops, I need to put print r. All right, we'll reload that. And so what this does, so I want to try and make sure this is clear if you're not familiar with this. Whenever you create a form like this, an HTML form like this, and you put the method of post, what that actually is going to do when you submit the form, when you submit the button for the form, is it's going to take the data that was in each one of these input fields, and it's going to put it into what's called a super global. And a super global is essentially it's a variable that in PHP that's available everywhere, right? So it's a global and it's a super global. So it's available basically everywhere. You don't have to, there's nothing you have to do. It's just kind of magically there, okay? And so that's what, when I do this print r, that's what this is, okay? Now, if you had used the get method, instead of using post like that, you would use print r get, okay? And there's other super globals that are out there, but those are the two when you're working with form data that you're primarily going to work with. And so all of our data that's submitted in the form, no matter how many inputs we had, we could add 100 more inputs in here. All of them are going to end up in this post super global. And that super global is, as you can see here, an array, and it's got our name and our email from our form. Okay, so that's why this name part right here is important, because that's what's going to be the key in for each element in our array. If we change this to full name, this would now be full name in here. Okay, so these are how we're going to reference what was submitted in the form throughout the rest of our code. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind as we go through this. Okay, so now I'm not going to go into all of this code yet, because I want to go to the other side and I want to show you the database side, because ultimately that's where our data is going to go. So for me, I'm going to go over to PHP MyAdmin. Now, depending on what environment you're in, maybe you're on a local host like WAMP server or XAMPP or something else like that, they usually have PHP MyAdmin available with that. A lot of times you just go to, if you're accessing it at localhost, you would go to localhost/PHP MyAdmin. So that's actually, for me, that's what I do. I have a URL for mine because it's a cloud ID, and I go to PHP MyAdmin, and this is what I get. If you're on a kind of a regular web server, then you may need to go into cPanel. And cPanel, there's usually, you can kind of scroll down and you'll find a link there that says PHP MyAdmin, and it'll kind of let you go into your different databases, and you'll see something similar to this. It all depends on what version of it they have installed and all that sort of thing. So it may not look exactly like this, but it should be pretty similar, and it'll be close enough that we can kind of function here on a similar page. So I don't have the database created at all yet, so I'm going to actually show you how to create the database. So that's kind of the first thing that we're going to want to do here is to create a database. So what we're going to do here is, you can see I'm on the home here. You have all these options over here in terms of query window, all these sorts of things. If we wanted, we could click into one of our databases here. It looks like I got logged out due to activity, so I'm going to log back in. And again, so there's all sorts of options in here. The thing we're looking for here is this databases link. So we'll click on this, and you'll see right at the top we have this create database. So I'm going to create a database called forms. Okay. And if you know the collation here, you have something specific that you want to use, you can certainly do that. I think as of this, I hesitate to tell you something specific, because this kind of tends to change a decent amount. So you probably ought to look this up depending on what time you're viewing this tutorial. I think the recommended right now is UTF-8 MB4_bin. So we'll just go ahead and use that here. But you may just want to do a quick Google search for kind of standard database collation and see what seems to be the flavor of the day for that particular time period. But anyway, or you could just leave it blank and let it kind of pick its own. But we'll hit create here. And so now it has created that database, and you can see that database is over here. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And now what we need to do is we need to create a table that we're going to submit this data into. So we're going to create a table called users, and the number of columns we're going to set to 3. And I'll show you why here in just a second. So users, columns 3, and we'll hit go. Okay, so we know we have our name and our email, the data that we're going to submit into this database. So that's only 2 columns. Why do we need 3? Well, we're going to create what's called an ID column. So we're going to give this first one a name of ID. And I'm going to leave that set to int. I'm going to set this to 20, and we're going to go primary key and not null, no default value, and that should be good there. So what we're doing here, we need to set auto increment. That's crucial here. Okay, this AI is auto increment. You need to make sure that that's checked. So basically what this is going to do is every time this form is submitted, it's going to create a new record in our database, and we'll take a look at what that looks like here in a second. But we want to be able to numerically kind of index those, right? If you think of an Excel spreadsheet, when you're in the spreadsheet, you have numbers along the left side that say 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have numbers across the top that say A, B, C, D. Well, by default, a database like this doesn't have those numbers along that left-hand side. So if you want those, and you pretty much any application you're going to want those, you need to actually create that. And so that's what this ID field is. Now, when you put on this auto increment, what it means is you don't have to manually put the numbers in there, right? So you don't have to specify the 1, the 2, the 3. What it's going to do is when the first record is submitted, it's going to automatically give that the number 1. The next record, it's going to automatically give it the number 2. So that's what the auto increment means. It's going to auto increment as each record is added. It's also going to use this as the primary key. So it's basically telling MySQL that this is the primary key for this database that we're going to be using for keying. Essentially, adding these ID numbers is what that is. So for keying this table, and it needs to be unique and all that sort of thing. So that's what this column is. Next, then, is the ones that you would kind of standard think of. So we're going to have name, and we're going to, now you could go back and forth here. If you're going to have something that has, maybe this is a comment box, or maybe you're creating a CMS and you're going to put, this is going to be your post content box. You would do something maybe bigger like text, or maybe you could go down here to long text. Depending on how much data you think is going to be put in there, you kind of decide, and there's all sorts of information out there about how to decide that, what ones are right for what scenario. Again, I want to try and keep this simple, so I don't want to get into all that. But here we're going to use varchar, and we're just going to go with 20 because name is going to be, it's going to be fairly, most names are going to be fairly short. So we don't have to, or actually we're going to do 40 because that should be plenty for what we need here. And then we're going to go with email, and we're going to go with 255, which is kind of a standard thing for using emails. And we're going to do varchar again. So varchar just means it's a variable characters. It could have, 5 characters in it. It could have 20. It just is something that's a variable, and the way that it fills kind of affects the way that it fills the data into the database. So you're not taking up as much room. And it helps with performance a little bit. That's kind of the basic idea here. It's not something to get too wrapped up into. For these, I would just kind of stick to this here. And then we don't need to set anything else for any of these. So we can go ahead and hit save here. And now that's going to create those. If we go to structure, we now have our ID field, we have our name field, and we have our email field. So we now have our structure that we can submit our data into. So we have our form that has that's going to actually collect the data. We now have our storage space that we're going to store that data into, kind of our if you want to use the analogy of a spreadsheet, we have the spreadsheet we're going to store the data into. Now we need to connect the two together, so when the form is submitted, it actually submits it to this table and this database. So that's what the PHP code we're going to talk about actually does. And we need to sync those things up. So with that said, there's a couple things that we need to look at here. So the first thing is we need to go into our config file. I like to put this stuff in a config file, and we need to specify a few things here for accessing our database. So the first thing that we need to specify is the name of the database. So remember, we created the database. It's called forms, and so we're going to specify the name of that database. Next, we need the user. So in this case, I'm just using the root account because I'm in a testing environment. And so the username and the password, so user and pass here, it's root and it's a blank password. Now that's default on, I would say, if you're using something like WAMP server, XAMPP, it's been a while since I've used some of those, but my recollection is that's pretty standard for testing environments, that it's going to be root and then a blank password. You may just need to check with whatever one you're using. It may be a little bit different, so you just check and then see. But when it comes to actual production servers, most of the time you're going to have a wizard where you actually create the database through cPanel. And when you create the database, it's going to have you set a username and a password. And so you're going to have those. Just make sure you kind of copy those down somewhere so you have those available to you. But those are what you would put in here. For the host, most setups, that's just going to be localhost. I have seen some, I think GoDaddy, where you have to specify something a little bit different. So if you try localhost and you're getting some sort of error related to the host, then you may go to your documentation for your web server and see if there's something else you need to specify, or contact your support there to see if there's something else you need to specify here. But I would say most of them, it's going to be this localhost thing. All right, so we're putting all of this in this config file so we don't have to constantly redefine it. We're defining them as constants, which means they're kind of basic. The way to put it is they're kind of globally available. They're going to be available inside and outside of functions by default. Now, we don't have any functions in this simple version, but in case we did, it's just kind of standard practice to put these in a config file. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close this because we won't be using it anymore. You can see we're doing a require once here to require that config file into our simple.php file. So that's basically bringing in the data from the config file. So now that we can access those constants here. All right, so with that set up, you can see here, this is actually our insertion code right here. So you can see it's really pretty simple. There's not a ton to it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to see if this post super global has any data in it. And the reason that we want to do that is because if we go to this form and no data has been submitted, so when someone first lands on the form, we don't want to do anything because there's no data to work with. And so we just are checking to see if this post super global is empty. If it's not empty, so that's what this exclamation point before empty means. So not empty, then that's when we're gonna do the rest of this stuff here. Okay, so we'll get rid of this here for a second, and we'll save that. And so the first thing that we need to do is make a connection to MySQL. So we're gonna instantiate a new instance of MySQL. So this is kind of the built-in MySQL extension for PHP. And of course, you could use PDO here if you're familiar with that. You can certainly do that. You can swap that out here. Again, I'm just trying to go with kind of the standard what's here and available inside of PHP. Although again, PDO is these days. But in any case, we're going to instantiate a new instance of MySQL. This is going to open up a connection to our database or to MySQL, and then select our database for us to be able to start working with. So we pass in the database host, which remember was localhost. We pass in our username, which remember from our config file was root. Our password was blank, and then the name of our database, which was forms. And what this does is creates basically a connection to our database that we can now start running queries on. Okay. Now we need to do that first because I'm going to use this method that's available to MySQL called real escape string. And you need to have the connection to MySQL before you can do this. Okay, so that's why we need to do this first. So what we're going to do is we're going to run array map. So essentially what array map does is it goes through an array and it sends every element in that array to a callback function that you specify. So what we're passing in for an array is our post array. Remember, we had our array that has all of the information from our form in it. So that's the array that we're going to loop through, and the function that we're going to send it to is actually a class method. And so when you do a class method, instead of just putting in the function name here, you put an array and you pass in the object variable here. So MySQL, this is what we connected to. And we pass in then the method name. So essentially what this array map is going to do is going to take every element in our post super global or post array, and it's going to run it through this MySQL real escape string method. Now what that method does is essentially escapes the data. So this is just a basic sort of security thing that we're doing here. And then it takes that escape data, puts it back into an array, and it gets saved as this data variable. And you'll see from here on, this data variable is going to be kind of what we work with. So This is a really, really basic security check here. Now, I want to caution you here. This is the absolute bare minimum, and really the only reason I even did this is because I didn't want to give you code that didn't have at least the bare minimum in terms of security. But this is not sufficient security for really using this in production, okay? I'm going to talk about security in the very next lesson. We're going to go in and go kind of all in on how to secure this. But I kind of debated between putting this in there and not putting this in there. And I decided to put it in there because I just didn't want to give you something that didn't have at least a bare minimum. But this is not sufficient. I'm trying to focus on the connection to MySQL and all that sort of thing. So I'm trying not to go heavy in security here. So what I want to caution you is thinking, oh, well, I'm good on security. I'm secure now. Yes, it's going to escape the data and it'll probably be fine, but there are some caveats to that, and there are some, we're not doing everything exactly perfectly here. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. All right, so with that out of the way, then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to run extract on our data. So essentially what that does is extract takes the elements from our array and it turns them into variables. And so it takes, and it uses, because it's an associative array, let me just go ahead and print this array back out since we're talking so much about it. So, and then exit. So let's go ahead and submit this form again so we can kind of see the data that we're working with here. So we'll submit that. Okay, so we have an associative array, means named key value pairs. So this is the key, and then this is the value for this element, and that's the first element in the array. And then we have a key and a value for this element here. So what extract does is it essentially takes this data and it creates a variable called name whose value is set to John Morris. So this would be essentially the same thing as saying name equals John Morris, right? It creates a variable with the name of the key and the value set to whatever's in the value here. Okay, so we're just doing that because we have an array. We're just doing it without having to specify each and every element that we want to work with here. Okay, so essentially after we run extract, what we have is we have a variable called name and a variable called email, and they're set to this data from this array accordingly. So now we can actually use that data. We need to do that because of the way that we're passing in the data here. Using the data straight from the array wouldn't work very well. This is going to be less of a thing when we get into the next part where we talk about securing it. But now here we can set up our query. So for inserting data into a database, we use the insert into, the name of our table, which remember was users, and then the columns that we want to submit the data into. So remember, in our database, we have a column, we have the ID column, the name column, and the email column. Now, we don't have to, like I said, we don't have to specify the ID. It's going to auto increment. So we can't even submit data to it even if we wanted. So all we need to specify are the other two columns. So the name column and the email column. So these are the columns we're going to submit data into. And then these are the values. And so it's name and email variables. So that's the data that we got from our form. So we go from the form to our post array, from our post array into our query here. So that's how we're tying our form through our PHP code ultimately to our database. So we're matching up columns with data from our form. This is ultimately, this variable name is data submitted from our form. This variable email is data submitted from our form. So it's passed from one thing to the other. Okay, and these are in order. So if I were to switch this around and say email name, the PHP code doesn't know any different. It would submit the name variable into the email column. Okay, so it's dumb in that sense. So you need to make sure that these are in the same order as one another. So name, email, name, email. All right, so now once we have that query all set up, then, and let me just run this, let me do a print R on, I guess I could just echo it, but we'll just do this since we're already there. Print R there, let's get rid of this one and show you the actual query. Oops. Need to resubmit the data. And so you can see insert into the users table, the name and email columns, the values, John Morris, and the email support, johnmorrisonline.com. You also notice these single quotes here. Those need to be there as well. Okay, just the way that it works. You need to have those there, otherwise the query won't work. All right, so once we have all that, then all we need to do is run our query. So we're going to pass our query that we just created here into this MySQL query method, which is actually going to run the query, send it to MySQL, and get a response back. So this is the actual, everything up to this point really is setting up to run our query. This is where we actually run it, is this line 14 right here. Okay, so when we do that, essentially with now the query method, it depends on what sort of query statement you send. So if you send a select statement, you're actually grabbing data from the database, and so you're gonna, if the query goes through, you're gonna get that data back. And there's certain other ones where what this query method returns is going to be different. But with an insert statement like this is simply going to return true or false. Okay, so this insert variable is either going to be true or it's going to be false. And so then we can use that. That's then what we use down here to specify our message. Right, so again, at this point, our data is either submitted or it's not. And then down here, we're going to say, well, okay, if insert is set to something, right? So if it's set to anything, then we want to see what it's set to. So if it's, we're going to display this either a success message or an error message. It depends what it's set to. But you need to wrap this in is set, otherwise the rest of these will give you a notice error. So basically run is set first, and then inside of that, if it's set to true, we're going to run this success message. And if it's set to anything else other than true, which would be false because it's either true or false, then we're going to display an error message and that there was an error with this submission. So if I'm going to just reload this, you can see we got this data was inserted successfully message from that data we just submitted. If we come over to our database here, we click back up on our users, you can see now we have our ID field, we have our name column, our email column, and we have our data submitted into our form here. So it was successfully submitted. So again, that is the pathway from the form through the PHP code ultimately into the database. So that is how to submit data from an HTML form into a MySQL database using PHP. Now, I know I've probably thrown a lot at you there. What I would recommend is you get in here and kind of mess with this yourself. We can talk about more fields and so forth a little bit later, but get in here and mess with this yourself, setting up your database, kind of figuring out the code. Go through this again if you need to, and just kind of really kind of dive into this, because this sort of thing, this form to database sort of thing, is just it's a really just key fundamental of building any sort of application or really building a website that has any sort of interactivity to it. It doesn't matter if you're collecting names and emails. It could be anything. If you look at Twitter, Twitter tweets, it's a form that you're submitting to. Facebook posts, it's a form you're submitting to. If you upload a YouTube video, most of what you have to fill out is filling out a form. So everything is forms. So this is a really key fundamental skill for if you want to be a coder, just website building in general. If you want to have an interactive website, you want to collect information, it's a key skill. So dig into this, kind of go through it, get your head around it, and it should start to become a little bit more clear. All right, that'll do it for this lesson. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.